The kitchen light was off. That was the first thing Marco noticed, not the movement, not the sound, but the absence of light in a room that should have been dark and still at 12:40 in the morning. A thin amber line bled under the door from the pendant fixture above the island, the one that stayed on its lowest setting when the house was fully locked down. It wasn't supposed to be on at all. He stood in the hallway in his socks, a glass of water in his hand that he hadn't drunk from yet, and he listened. No sound. Just the faint mechanical breath of the refrigerator and something else, a rhythm without music. A movement that had weight to it. He pushed the door open 2 inches. She was barefoot on the stone floor, facing the far window, and she had no idea he was there. Her back was to him, her arms raised at an angle that had nothing domestic about it, nothing that belonged in this kitchen, in this house, in the role she'd been hired to occupy for the past 11 months. Her right arm extended in a line so precise it looked architectural. Her left knee lifted, held, descended. She turned once on the ball of her foot, a controlled, complete rotation, and the hem of her gray sleep shirt moved with her like water disturbed by something that had passed through it. Marco did not move. She went through it again, the same sequence, beginning with that raised arm, moving through the turn, ending in a position with her weight forward, chin down, like something unfinished that she'd been trying to finish for a very long time. Then she dropped. Not collapsed, dropped deliberately, gracefully, sat cross-legged on the cold stone, and pressed her palms flat against the floor. He pushed the door the rest of the way open. She heard it. Her head came up. She was on her feet in a single motion, not startled, not apologetic, just standing, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they've been waiting for without admitting they were waiting. Mr. Varelli. Her voice was even. Lina. Neither of them moved. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, past the dark glass, the Long Island Sound was invisible beneath cloud cover, and the Belvedere Estate's rear lawn was nothing but black. She moved first, toward the counter, where she'd left a cloth, and she picked it up and folded it in a way that wasn't necessary. Her hands needed somewhere to be. You couldn't sleep, she said, not asking. Neither could you. She folded the cloth a second time. Marco set his water glass on the island and didn't look away from her. He'd noticed her hands before, not in any way he'd acted on, just a thing he'd filed without meaning to. The way she held a tray. The way she straightened the linens on the dining table and sometimes, mid-motion, stopped and held the position for 1 second longer than the task required. He'd attributed it to precision. To the particular attentiveness of someone who was very good at their job. He understood now what it actually was. New Haven Conservatory, he said. The folding stopped. Full scholarship program. Accepted at 17. He picked up his water glass, turned it once in his hand. You were in the second cohort of their intensive track. The one they dissolved. He looked at her. That's where you trained. She set the cloth down. I trained in a lot of places, she said. Not like that. Her jaw shifted slightly. She looked toward the window, the black glass, the invisible water, and then back at him, and the evenness in her voice when she spoke again cost her something he could see in the set of her shoulders. Is there a reason we're having this conversation at 1 a.m, Mr. Varelli? I have a problem. Then I'd suggest sleep, and we can discuss it in the morning. The Manhattan Gala. He moved to the island, leaned against it, arms crossed. 3 weeks of preparation and the principal performer withdrew this afternoon. Contractual dispute. Halbert's people called at 9. He looked at the floor, then at her. I need someone who can perform at that level in 3 days. Something passed through her, not visibly, but he'd been watching closely enough to catch it. A stillness that wasn't calm. I'm not a performer, she said. I'm your housekeeper. You were your housekeeper 20 minutes ago. I was, she stopped. Started again, quieter. I was stretching. Marco said nothing. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has mass to it, the kind that presses on both people equally. The gala is Thursday, he said. Manhattan. Victor Halbert is hosting and his list of attendees includes people I've worked with for 12 years. The performance is the centerpiece of the evening. Without it, the event falls apart and Halbert loses face in front of everyone who matters to him. He paused. And to me. Lina looked at him steadily. Find another performer. In 3 days. That's your problem, not mine. At your level? In 3 days? He said it flatly, without force, just fact laid against fact. She said nothing. Her hands were still on the counter and she was looking at him with an expression that he couldn't read cleanly. It had too many layers running simultaneously, the way a face looks when a person is deciding not how to answer a question, but whether to answer it at all. I need you to come to Manhattan on Thursday, Marco said. That's the conversation. And if I decline? He picked up his water glass. Then I'd respect that. He moved toward the door. Stopped with his hand on the frame. But someone at that event worked closely with the New Haven Conservatory in the years before the program ended. Someone who was present for everything that happened to that second cohort. He didn't look back. I thought you'd want to know that. He left her standing in the kitchen with the amber light and the cold stone floor and the cloth sheet folded twice for no reason, and he walked back down the hallway toward the east wing. Behind him, he heard nothing. Not her voice, not her footsteps, not the sound of that cloth being unfolded a third time. Just the refrigerator. Just the house breathing. Just the Long Island sound outside, invisible, carrying whatever it carried in the dark. She was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs at 6:15. Coffee made, table set, curtains drawn back to let in the flat gray light off the water. She moved through the space the way she always did, efficient, quiet, occupying exactly as much room as the task required and no more. She didn't look at him when he came in. He sat down. She poured coffee. He didn't thank her and she didn't expect him to. That was the established grammar of this household, and neither of them had ever needed to acknowledge it. Victor Halbert, she said, without preamble. He looked up. She was standing at the counter with the coffee pot in her hand. She hadn't turned around. The Victor Halbert. Meridian Capital. Yes. She set the coffee pot down. Turned. Looked at him with something that was organized, carefully organized, the way a room looks when someone has cleaned it specifically to avoid thinking about what's been hidden inside the closet. He's one of yours. He's a client. Has been for 6 years. And the event Thursday. His private charitable gala. Annual. Halbert Foundation for the Arts. He wrapped both hands around his mug. The irony is not lost on me. She looked at him for a long moment. What exactly did you mean last night? About someone from the conservatory. I meant what I said. That's not an answer. He set the mug down. I have reason to believe that a person connected to the events that ended the New Haven program will be present Thursday evening as a guest of Halbert's. Possibly as a speaker. Reason to believe from where? My business. She held his gaze for exactly 4 seconds. Then she turned back to the counter and began straightening things that didn't need to be straightened. I don't perform anymore, she said. You performed last night for an audience of 1. That was different. How? She didn't answer. He watched her hands move across the counter, aligning a bowl with the edge of the cutting board, turning a jar so the label faced front. Small corrections, each one precise. Your family is in Bridgeport, he said. Her hand stopped. Your mother and your brother. The apartment on Seaview. You've been sending. Don't. Quiet. Absolute. He stopped. Outside, a boat was crossing the Sound, its running light visible through the gray. He watched it and let the silence settle before he spoke again. I'm not making a threat, Lina. It doesn't matter what you're making. If you leave this position, the lease arrangement. I said don't. He nodded once. Drank his coffee. She stood with her back to him and both hands flat on the counter, and for a long moment the kitchen held only the sound of the water outside and the faint knock of rigging against the dock. "I need your answer by morning," he said. "This is morning. Tomorrow morning." She turned. Her face had settled into something he recognized as a decision not yet made, but one that had already narrowed its own options. "What exactly would I be performing?" He reached into the pocket of his shirt and slid a folded paper across the island toward her. The program was already structured. Movement piece. Contemporary. No partner, no chorus. 6 minutes. He paused. "The composer is someone you may know." She didn't touch the paper. "I'll need the morning," she said. He pushed his chair back. "You have until tomorrow." He carried his mug to the sink, rinsed it, left it upright in the drying rack, and walked out of the kitchen and into the hallway, and behind him he heard her unfold the paper. He didn't look back. He went to his study and closed the door and sat in front of his laptop and opened a browser and typed 3 words into a search field. New Haven Conservatory Scandal. The results loaded. The first result was a 6-year-old article from the Connecticut Arts Review. The second was a financial disclosure filing. The third was a name he already knew. He leaned back. 3 days. Victor Halbert's voice on the phone had a particular quality, the quality of a man who had never once needed to raise it. "Marco." Not a greeting. A placement. "You are where I expected you to be, and I am where I have always been." Victor. Marco stood at the window of his study, the sound stretched out below the lawn, a container ship moving slowly toward New Haven Harbor. "I'm aware of the situation." "Are you?" A pause that was long enough to be deliberate. "Because my program director called me at 7 this morning and used the phrase irreparably compromised, which is not a phrase I enjoy hearing 72 hours before an event that has been 12 months in the planning. I have a solution. You have a possibility. I'd like to hear what distinguishes one from the other." Marco turned from the window. "I have access to a performer. Trained at the conservatory level. The program will hold. Name? I'll confirm the name once I have her agreement." A silence. Her. Halbert let the word sit there, extracting information from it. "This is someone you know personally." "She's been working in my household." Another pause, longer this time, and in it Marco could hear the particular kind of recalibration that happened when a man like Halbert received unexpected information and was deciding whether to accept the new shape of things or apply pressure, until they returned to the old one. "Your household." "Yes. You're proposing to put a member of your domestic staff on a stage at my gala." "I'm proposing to put a trained conservatory-level dancer on a stage at your gala. The domestic arrangement is incidental." "Marco." The voice hadn't changed, still level, still quiet, but something behind it had. "Thursday is not an experiment. I know what Thursday is. There will be 47 people in that room whose opinion of this foundation, and by extension of the people they associate with it, will be shaped by what they see on that stage. I need you to understand the weight of what you're guaranteeing." "I do." "And you're guaranteeing it." Marco looked at the window, at the container ship that had moved no closer to the harbor, at the flat gray water that held no warmth this time of year. "I'm guaranteeing it," he said. Halbert exhaled, a small sound, controlled. "I'll expect a name and a program brief by noon tomorrow. If I don't have both by noon, I'll begin alternative arrangements, and the cost of that scramble will be reflected in our next conversation." The call ended. Marco set the phone on his desk. He sat down in front of his laptop and opened the browser he'd been working in earlier, and he went back to the third result, the financial disclosure filing, and he read it more carefully this time. The filing was 6 years old. The attached document linked to a secondary filing, which linked to a third, and the third contained a name that appeared 3 times in 3 different contexts, all of them pointing at the same event, all of them pointing at the same institution. He opened a new tab and searched for the name directly. The image results loaded. He looked at the photo for a long time. A man in his 60s. Silver-haired, well-cut suit, the particular ease of posture that comes from a lifetime of rooms arranging themselves around you. Photographed at an event, a charitable event, the caption said. Arts funding. The name of the foundation in the caption was not Halbert's, but the man standing 3 feet away from the subject, slightly out of focus, was Victor Halbert. Marco's hand moved across the trackpad. He saved the image. He opened a second browser window and began going through 6 years of financial press coverage with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that what he was looking for would not announce itself. Downstairs, he heard nothing from the kitchen. No movement, no sound. Just the house, just the water, just the slow passage of the container ship toward a harbor it would reach well after dark. He kept reading. She didn't go back to bed. After Marco's footsteps faded down the hall, Lina stood in the kitchen for a long time with the folded paper in her hand, and then she set it on the counter, face down, and she made herself eat something. Half a piece of toast, a glass of water, because she had learned a long time ago that the body needs something to hold when the mind is running. The name on the program brief was Elias Vaughan. She turned it over only once. Read it only once. Then put it face down. She knew Elias Vaughan's work the way you know the sound of a voice you've heard in a particular room at a particular moment in your life, not just auditory memory but spatial memory, bodily memory, the kind that lives below the level where language operates. She'd rehearsed to 2 of his compositions in New Haven. She'd stood in Studio C of the conservatory's main building at 7 in the morning with the heat not yet fully on and the floor cold through her shoes, and she'd run the same sequence 40 times because the piece was asking something from her body that her body wasn't yet willing to give. She went upstairs. Changed. Came back down. She did not go into the studio. The Belvedere estate had a converted carriage house at the east end of the property that Marco used as an overflow office, but the main room of it, the long room with the wood floors, she had never once entered. Not in 11 months. She walked past it every morning on her way to the groundskeeper's shed to check supplies. She had walked past it 400 times. She went into the kitchen instead. The kitchen had 11 feet of clear floor between the island and the back wall. Not enough, but enough. She stood in the middle of it and looked at the back wall, and she did not close her eyes. That had been a habit once, closing her eyes before beginning. Her first instructor in Bridgeport had spent 6 months breaking her of it. The stage doesn't disappear when you close your eyes. Neither does the audience. Neither does the floor. She'd been 14 and she'd hated him for it, and then she'd understood it, and then she'd been grateful in the way you're grateful for things that took something from you. She raised her right arm. Her body knew what came next. It ran the sequence without her instructing it, not perfectly, not with the extension she'd once had, but with a structural memory that had not eroded despite everything she'd done to bury it. Her hips found the line. Her knee found the height. The turn happened at the right moment and landed where it was supposed to land, and she stood in the kitchen at 7:40 in the morning in her work clothes with her weight forward and her chin down, and she breathed. She went through it again. Then a third time, adjusting. She stopped when she heard the side door of the study open and close, Marco heading out to the dock, probably where he went when calls went badly. She waited. His footsteps crossed the stone path outside the kitchen window and continued toward the water. She picked up her phone from the counter and opened a browser. The search she typed was reflexive, the kind of thing she'd trained herself not to do in the 4 years since she'd left New Haven Conservatory, and she hit enter before she could stop herself. The first results were the conservatory's current website. Events listings. Enrollment information. She scrolled past them. The sixth result was a piece from the Connecticut Arts Review published 4 days ago. She almost kept scrolling. Then the subheading caught her. Former scholarship students renew calls for independent investigation as conservatory prepares 10th anniversary program. She read it standing up, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, and when she reached the third paragraph she stopped and read it again. The investor was not named. He was referred to as a major institutional donor whose involvement in the 2019 funding irregularities has never been formally investigated. She knew who it was. Everyone who had been there knew who it was. The article didn't say his name because the article was 4 days old and he was still powerful enough that a regional arts journal would not print his name without a legal team standing behind them. She set the phone face down on the counter. Outside, she could hear Marco's footsteps returning from the dock, slow, even, unhurried. She picked up a cloth and began wiping the counter she'd already wiped an hour ago, and when the back door opened she didn't look up. "The program brief," she said, without turning around. He stopped in the doorway. 6 minutes. Vaughn's composition. She kept wiping the counter. "What version?" A pause. "The revised 2021 arrangement." She nodded once, still not looking at him. "I'll need the audio file." "And the studio." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "The carriage house is unlocked." She heard him cross the kitchen and go back into the house, and she stood with the cloth in her hand and looked at the back wall with its 11 feet of floor, and she thought about a room with the heat not yet fully on and a floor cold through her shoes and a sequence she'd run 40 times and the particular quality of a piece of music that asks for something your body hasn't decided to give yet. She found the article herself, 3 days after it happened. Not the recent one, the original. The one that had run in January of 2020 in a financial publication that nobody in the dance world read, which was precisely why nobody in the dance world had ever seen it. She'd been back in Bridgeport for 2 weeks by then. She'd been sleeping on the couch because her brother was in her old room, and her mother had just started the job at the laundry on Stratford Avenue, and the first week of February the pipes in the apartment had burst and the landlord, their particular landlord, the one who had the lease arrangement with the firm that had the lease arrangement with the building owner, had done nothing for 9 days. The article quoted him by name. Not as the source of the problems. As the wrong party. Reginald Carver. The piece framed him as a dedicated patron of arts education who had discovered, with considerable personal distress, that the New Haven Conservatory's second cohort scholarship program had been financially mismanaged by its internal administration. He expressed concern for the students involved. He indicated that he had, reluctantly, provided documentation of the irregularities to the appropriate bodies. He was photographed in his office in front of a wall of framed photographs, himself with artists, himself with civic leaders, himself with the kind of people whose names appeared on buildings. Lina had stared at that photograph for a long time. She had been the one who found the discrepancy. She'd been treasurer of the student representative body, a ceremonial role. Nobody had expected her to actually read the financial documents, and she'd found it in the disbursement records for the third quarter of 2019. Scholarship funds redirected. A pattern that was too deliberate to be error, too small in each individual instance to trigger any automatic review. She brought it to the program director. The program director had told her to bring it to the donor liaison. The donor liaison worked for Reginald Carver. What happened after that happened quickly. Interviews with the conservatory's board. Documents that named her, not as the person who found the discrepancy, but as a student who had improperly accessed confidential financial records. A formal complaint. A letter from a law firm in New York that arrived at her mother's apartment in Bridgeport and that used language she'd had to look up: tortious interference, financial misconduct, misappropriation of institutional documentation. She was 19. Her mother's lease was managed through a subsidiary of a firm that had 3 board members in common with the conservatory's primary donor committee. It took Lina 4 days to map that out, and when she had it mapped out she sat with it in silence and understood what she was looking at. She withdrew from the program voluntarily. She signed the confidentiality agreement. She returned to Bridgeport and she did not dance publicly again, and the case was closed, and Reginald Carver continued to appear in photographs in front of walls covered in other people's achievements. She didn't tell anyone. Not her mother, who would have been destroyed by the weight of it. Not her brother, who was 16 and didn't need to carry it. Not the other students from the cohort, because the confidentiality agreement had real teeth and she'd understood that clearly. She carried it alone, and she built a life around carrying it, and the life was not nothing. It was real work, real care, real presence in a household where she was trusted and where the money was good enough to keep the apartment on Seaview and her mother's utilities paid and her brother in school. It was a contained life. It was, most of the time, enough. She was standing in the carriage house studio, the long room, the wood floors, the ceiling high enough to work in, when Marco knocked and opened the door. She'd been there for 2 hours. The audio file from Vaughn's 2021 arrangement had been running on her phone speaker, and she'd worked through the first movement twice and was standing at the far end of the room with her back to the door and her weight on her left foot, thinking. "Carver," she said. She heard him stop. "He's attending Thursday." She turned around. "That's who you meant?" "Last night, in the kitchen." Marco stood in the doorway with his jacket still on, the way he looked when he'd come directly from somewhere. His expression was steady, the particular steadiness of a man who has already decided something but is waiting to see if the person in front of him has decided the same thing. "He's been invited as a speaker," Marco said. "Arts Philanthropy segment. Halbert's team confirmed this morning." She looked at him. The music had stopped, her phone had locked, and the studio was very quiet, the stone walls and the wood floor holding the silence the way old buildings do. "You knew," she said. "Before last night. You knew who he was before you walked into the kitchen." He didn't answer immediately. "I had a suspicion." "Then, yes." She walked to the center of the room and stopped there. She looked at the floor. "He's going to stand on a stage that I perform on," she said. "That's what you're telling me. He's going to stand on a stage. Whether you perform is still your decision. You made that very clear when you mentioned my mother's apartment." "I made a mistake in saying that." He said it without softening, just placed it in the room as its own object. "It was a pressure I had no right to apply." She looked up. "No. You didn't." Outside, past the carriage house windows, the November light was going, the flat gray of early afternoon thinning toward the flat gray of early evening, the water beyond the lawn already losing its definition. "What do you want, exactly?" she said. "Not what you told Halbert. What do you actually want from Thursday?" He reached into his jacket and took out his phone. He turned it and held it toward her. On the screen was a document, a financial disclosure, lines of text, tables, figures. She looked at it without taking the phone. "That's 6 years old," she said. "There's a current version. Filed 4 months ago under a subsidiary name." He held the phone steady. "Carver has been doing the same thing again. Different institution, same structure, different cohort of students." He paused. "The conservatory closed. He found another program." She looked at the document on the screen for a long time without moving. "I can get this in front of the right people," Marco said. "Financial regulators, Arts Council oversight, 2 journalists who have been waiting for a second source. But to do it Thursday, to do it in that room, in front of Halbert's list, I need something that puts Carver publicly on record before the document lands. Something that makes it impossible for him to step away from the room quietly." He put the phone back in his pocket. "Your presence on that stage, in front of people who know the conservatory's history, that changes what happens when the document surfaces." She stood in the center of the studio floor. The wood beneath her feet was old, slightly uneven, the kind that creaked at the edges and held firm in the middle. "You want me to be the story," she said. "I want him to have no room to manage the story." She looked at him for a long time. "Leave me alone," she said. He left. She stood there for another hour. She didn't turn the music back on. She worked in silence, the first movement, the second, the transition between them that Vaughn's composition left deliberately unresolved, open-ended, waiting for the performer to make the choice about how to cross it. By the time she came back into the main house, it was dark and cold and her feet were aching and she had not decided anything. But her body had. The brief Marco gave her the next morning was 4 pages. He'd left it on the kitchen island before she came down, no conversation, just the document there beside her coffee cup, the Halberd Foundation letterhead at the top, the program sequence mapped out in clean columns. She read it over breakfast without sitting down, standing at the island with her mug in one hand and the pages in the other. The performance was listed as contemporary solo, guest artist. No name. The slot was 20 minutes into the program, after the reception and before the keynote remarks. Carver was scheduled to speak at minute 40. There would be 47 seated guests. The stage was a portable raised platform in the northeast corner of Halberd's Manhattan residence, the same space the foundation had used for 3 previous galas. She set the pages down. Guest artist. No name. She understood what that meant in terms of logistics. She'd be announced without a name, introduced only as the evening's featured performer. She'd walk onto a stage in front of 47 people who did not know who she was. She'd perform Vaughan's piece, which everyone in that room who'd had any serious involvement with New Haven arts funding would recognize. And then Carver would stand up 20 minutes later to speak about arts philanthropy, and Marco would do whatever Marco intended to do with the documents. The question was what happened between those 2 moments. She was at the carriage house by 7. She ran the full piece 3 times through, beginning, middle, the unresolved transition, the ending that Vaughan had written as an open question. She stopped at the transition each time and made a different choice, testing each one, feeling where it held and where it dissolved. At 9:15, Marco appeared in the studio doorway. "Halberd called," he said. She stopped. Turned. "He's asking questions." Marco leaned against the door frame, jacket off, sleeves rolled. "Not about you specifically, he doesn't know who you are yet. He's asking why I'm taking a direct interest in the performance segment. I've managed his events for 6 years and I've never involved myself in programming." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd found an exceptional performer and wanted to ensure the slot was handled correctly." He paused. "He accepted it. For now." She walked to the side of the room where she'd left a water bottle and drank, looking at him. "He's going to put it together," she said. "Not before Thursday." "You don't know that." "I know Halberd. He doesn't investigate things he doesn't yet have reason to investigate." She set the bottle down. "And when he does have reason, by then it won't matter." She looked at him steadily. "It will matter to me." He held her gaze. "Yes. I know. I need to understand something." She walked toward the center of the room, then stopped, facing him. "The document, the current disclosure. Where does it go? Who gets it and when?" "2 journalists. Both financial press. One of them has been building the Carver story for 8 months and needs a second source and a public moment to trigger publication." He folded his arms. "Thursday provides both." "And the second journalist?" "Arts and culture. She's been talking to former students from the new program. She doesn't have the financial documentation yet. So between the 2 of them, the story becomes very difficult to contain." She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the wood floor. Outside the windows, the morning had turned bright and cold, actual November sun for the first time in 4 days, and the shadows of the carriage house windows fell across the floor in clean rectangles. "If I perform without a name," she said, "and then my name surfaces anyway, it will surface. I won't pretend otherwise. Then the anonymity isn't protection. It's just a delay." "Yes. So the real question isn't whether I perform anonymously. The real question is whether I perform at all." He didn't answer, because it wasn't a question that needed answering. She just said the thing they'd both been moving around for 2 days. She walked back to the center of the floor. Stood there. The sunlight through the windows lay across the wood in a grid of light and shadow, and she stood in the middle of it, neither in one nor the other. "I need to know," she said, "that the confidentiality agreement I signed doesn't expose me. I've had it reviewed. It covered the original event. The scope does not extend to public identification of yourself as a former student." He paused. It was drafted to silence you, not to prevent you from ever existing in public again. She exhaled through her nose. I'd like that in writing, she said. He nodded once. You'll have it by tonight. She turned to face the far wall, the long, bare wall that had been her frame of reference for 2 hours. She raised her arms. Close the door, she said. He did. The message came through at 9 on Wednesday morning. Not to Lina, she didn't know about it until after, and when she found out, it was already too late to unmake any decision. The message came through Marco's business email, routed from Halbert's Foundation address, and the subject line read Thursday program, preliminary guest review. It wasn't a routine correspondence. The attachment was a participant summary, standard for Halbert's events, a document Marco had seen a dozen times before, listing confirmed guests with their institutional affiliations and seating assignments. He opened it over breakfast. Carver's name was on page 2. Confirmed, speaker slot, as expected. 3 rows behind Carver's assigned seat, there was a name Marco didn't immediately recognize, and he read it twice before he placed it. Armand Voss. General Counsel, Carver Capital Management. A lawyer in the room was not extraordinary. What was extraordinary was the addition, marked with an asterisk and a footnote in small type at the bottom of the page, guest of Mr. Carver, added Thursday a.m. Added this morning. Marco sat very still with the document on his screen. Voss had been added to the list in the last 12 hours. Carver had requested the addition. Carver was bringing his lawyer to an arts gala. He thought about what that could mean if it was coincidence. He thought about what it meant if it wasn't. He sent a message to his own lawyer at 9:14 and had a call by 9:45 and ended the call at 10:03 with a specific piece of information. Armand Voss had filed legal correspondence on Carver's behalf in 3 separate cases in the last 4 years involving confidentiality agreements, institutional disclosures, and reputational claims. He was not an arts philanthropy lawyer. He was a containment specialist. Someone had told Carver something. Not enough, not Lina's name, not the specific nature of Thursday's performance, or Voss would have been added to the list days ago. But something. A fragment. A suggestion that what was planned for Thursday was not simply a replacement performance. Marco went to find Lina at 10:15. She was in the carriage house, in the middle of the second movement, and she didn't stop when he opened the door, so he stood in the doorway and waited until she reached the transition, the open question in the middle of Vaughan's structure, and stopped herself there, as she always did. Carver knows something, he said. She turned. Her breath was controlled. She'd been working for 2 hours and she was not winded, which told him something about the level she'd recovered. He told her about Voss. He told her about the timeline. He told her what his lawyer had said about Voss's professional history. She listened without moving. When he finished, she turned and walked to the window and looked out at the lawn and the water beyond it, and he watched the muscles across her shoulders. He doesn't know it's me, she said. No. But he suspects the performance is connected to the conservatory. Or connected to someone working against him. Marco moved into the room. That may be enough for him to take precautionary action. What kind of action? Voss could request that Halbert review the program. If Halbert pulls the performance slot, the whole thing collapses. Yes. She kept looking at the water. Does Halbert know about the documents? No. Would he protect Carver if he did? Marco considered the question with the care it deserved. Halbert is not corrupt. But Carver has been in his orbit for a long time, and Halbert has a strong preference for problems that resolve themselves quietly. He paused. If Voss approaches Halbert before Thursday and frames this as a legal risk to the Foundation, Halbert may decide the simplest solution is to cancel the performance. She turned from the window. Her face had the quality of a surface that's been stripped down to what's underneath, no management, no performance, just the thing itself. Then we move first, she said. Moving first means you commit. Tonight. I know. If you commit and Halbert pulls the slot anyway. I know. She said it the second time with a different weight. Not impatience, something more considered. If I commit and he pulls it, we lose the room, but we still have the documents. She looked at him. And I still have my name. Marco watched her. The confidentiality agreement review, she said. You sent it. At 8 this morning. I read it. He waited. There's a clause, she said. Section 4, paragraph 3. Related proceedings. It's broad. My lawyer flagged the same clause. His reading is that it doesn't hold. He held her gaze. But I can't guarantee it. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the floor, the old wood, the uneven boards at the edges, the firm center. I need to call my brother, she said. He nodded. Give me an hour. He left. He walked back across the lawn toward the main house, and he did not look at his phone, even though it had buzzed twice in his pocket during the conversation. Whatever it was, it would still be there in an hour. He went to his study. He closed the door. He opened his laptop and began preparing the document package, 2 copies for the journalists, 1 copy held separately, 1 copy encrypted on a server in a city neither of them was in. He did not know what Lina would decide. He worked. She called her brother from the carriage house. She walked outside first, around the back of the building, away from the estate's windows, into the strip of dead grass between the carriage house and the stone wall that separated the property from the neighboring hedge. She stood with her back against the cold stone and the late November air pulling at her shirt. Her brother picked up on the second ring. She didn't explain everything. She explained enough: the gala, the documents, the name. Her brother was 23 and smarter than most people gave him credit for, and he'd grown up with the same absence she had, the same shape where a dance career should have been, the same weight in the apartment that nobody talked about directly. When she finished, he was quiet for 6 seconds. Does Mama know any of this? He said. No. Are you going to tell her? After. After might be messy. Yes. Another pause. What do you need from me? She exhaled. The stone wall behind her was cold through her shirt. I need you to tell me I'm not making this decision because I'm angry. He thought about it. She could hear him thinking, that particular quality of his silence that was active rather than absent. You're making it because you're angry, he said. But that's not the only reason. Then, is the thing even true? The new program, the same pattern? Marco has documents. You've seen them? Yes. Then go, he said. And call me after. She stood against the wall for another minute after the call ended. The sound was audible from here, just barely, the low push of water against the dock, a sound so constant she'd stopped registering it 2 months after she'd moved into the Belvedere house. She registered it now. She went back inside. She ran the piece from the beginning. The whole piece, without stopping, through the first movement, through the second, through the transition she'd been circling for 3 days. She made the choice at the transition point, not the cautious choice, not the retreating choice, but the one that committed the full weight of the body forward, and she carried it through to the end and stood in the center of the floor breathing. Then she went to find Marco. He was in his study. She knocked and opened the door, and he looked up from his laptop with an expression that had been managed for the last hour into something neutral and careful. I'll perform Thursday, she said. He held her gaze. Under my name, she said. Not guest artist. My name. A pause. That changes the announcement. Yes. I know. Halbert will need. I know what Halbert will need. She stood in the doorway. I want it confirmed before we leave. My name in the program. No asterisk, no footnote. Lina Alvarez. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he turned to his laptop and began typing. She watched him. Outside his study window, the afternoon light had gone the color of old copper, the water flat beneath it. Done, he said. She nodded. She was turning to leave when he said, There's one more thing. She stopped. Halbert confirmed the evening's program sequence this morning. He kept his eyes on the screen. The introductory remarks for the performance segment, he paused. Halbert assigned them to Carver. She stood in the doorway. Carver will introduce you, Marco said. The copper light through the window hadn't moved. The water hadn't moved. The room held everything in the same position as a moment before, and the only thing that had changed was the specific arrangement of what Thursday would look like, a man who had taken her name from her, standing on a stage, speaking the name she had just insisted on using. She stood there and let the shape of it settle into her fully. Good, she said. She left. The Manhattan residence was on the Upper East Side, a pre-war building with a private events floor that Halbert had spent 4 years and a significant portion of his foundation's operational budget converting into something that looked, from the right angle, like a place where culture actually happened. Lina arrived an hour before the guests. She walked the stage, the portable raised platform in the northeast corner, 14 feet wide, 10 feet deep, with a ceiling clearance that was exactly enough and not more. She stood in the center of it and looked at the room. 47 chairs in a semicircle, the stage at the apex, a small speaker system mounted at either side that the sound technician was still adjusting. She went through the piece twice in the wings, a narrow corridor behind a partition where she had 8 feet to work with. It was enough. Marco found her there at 7:50. He looked at her once, a look that contained a question, and she returned it with nothing, just the level attention of someone who has finished deciding and is now only doing. The journalists are positioned, he said. Both confirmed. And the documents? On delivery. Encrypted message to both addresses. Triggered on my instruction. He paused. I'll send it during the performance. While Carver is in his seat and the room is watching the stage. She nodded. The timing matters, he said. The message arrives, they open it, they verify the attachment. By the time Carver stands up to speak, he'll walk to that podium with 2 journalists already reading the disclosure. Yes. She pulled the back of her wrist across her forehead, a movement that had nothing to do with sweat and everything to do with having a body that needed something to do with itself. And Voss, she said. He's in the room. 3rd row. She absorbed that. He'll try to move on Carver's behalf. After the fact, yes. But the first story will be published before midnight. He held her gaze. Once it's published, there's no before the fact. She looked at the stage. 14 feet wide. 10 feet deep. The sound technician had finished and the speaker system was now running a low test tone, barely audible, just a vibration at the bottom of the frequency range. She felt it in her feet through the floor. Ready, she said. He left. She stood in the corridor until 8:15, when the guests had assembled and the room had filled to its arranged quiet, the particular hush of 47 people who were accustomed to being in each other's company and had arranged their faces accordingly. She could hear it through the partition, the subsidence of ambient conversation as Halbert moved to the podium, the welcome remarks, the land acknowledgement, the brief and practiced summary of the Foundation's year. Then Halbert said, I'm pleased to introduce the evening's featured performer. She comes to us through a very personal recommendation from Marco Varelli, whose judgment I have trusted for 6 years and whose eye for exceptional talent I should perhaps have been leveraging long before now. A small appreciation from the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Lina Alvarez. Silence. She heard it, the silence between the name and the response, the pause in the room while 47 people processed the name and found it familiar or unfamiliar or somewhere between. Then the sound of Halbert moving back from the podium, and footsteps, and the stage lights changing. She walked out. She didn't look at the audience immediately. She took the stage the way her first Bridgeport instructor had taught her, foot, center, weight settled, and then she looked up. 47 faces. 3rd row, second from the right, a man with silver hair and a well-cut suit, the particular ease of posture that comes from a lifetime of rooms arranging themselves around you. He was looking at her. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at the back wall, the far wall of the room, past the audience, the fixed point, and the music began. Vaughn's 2021 arrangement opened softly. Piano and cello, both restrained, both building towards something they wouldn't arrive at for 40 seconds. She moved with the opening, the first movement she'd known since she was 17, the physical grammar of it so embedded in her body that it ran without her deciding it, and she let it run, let the room recede to its proper position, and she worked. She didn't think about Carver. She didn't think about Voss in the third row or the journalists in the back or Marco standing somewhere at the edge of the room with his phone in his hand. She thought about the floor beneath her feet and the ceiling above her and the 8 feet of Studio C at the New Haven Conservatory on a January morning with the heat not yet on and the sequence she'd run 40 times, because the piece was asking for something her body wasn't yet willing to give. She gave it now. The transition arrived, the open question, the unresolved center of Vaughn's structure, and she crossed it the way she'd decided in the carriage house, the full-weight forward choice, the committed one, and the room changed. She felt it change. The silence of 47 people shifted from polite attention to something denser and more specific, and she was aware of it but not distracted by it, and she kept moving. Somewhere in the room, a phone was open. 2 phones. 2 journalists reading a financial disclosure document with their eyes moving quickly across columns of figures. She finished the piece. She stood at center stage with her weight forward and her chin down and the music ending beneath her, and the room was quiet for 2 full seconds after the last note, a real silence, not a hell-breath silence, the kind that happens when a room has received something it wasn't prepared for. Then the applause. She looked up. Carver was applauding. His face was composed, his hands moving together at the appropriate pace, and he was watching her with an expression that had reassembled itself from whatever it had been 20 seconds ago into something appropriate. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them was performing anything anymore. She stepped off the stage. Marco was at her shoulder the moment she cleared the partition. He said nothing, just turned his phone briefly toward her, the sent confirmation on 2 encrypted messages, timestamps from 4 minutes ago, 2 red receipts already returned. She nodded. 12 minutes later, Reginald Carver walked to the podium. She was in the corridor behind the partition, and she heard his voice, the controlled baritone of a man who had never not had a room, and she heard him begin the remarks he'd prepared about arts philanthropy and institutional support and the role of private capital in sustaining cultural education. She heard him stop. Not a dramatic stop. A small one. A pause that ran 3 seconds longer than the cadence of his sentences required. She heard him recover, continue, but the recovery was visible to anyone who'd been listening, and 47 people had been listening, and at least 2 of them had their phones in their laps. He finished. The room applauded. Halbert stood and moved to the podium and thanked him, and in the shuffle of movement, Carver stepping back, Halbert adjusting the microphone, Armand Voss stood from the 3rd row and moved quietly toward the side of the room. She watched through the gap in the partition as Voss reached Carver and spoke directly into his ear. Carver's face did not change. That was the thing, it simply did not change, and the absence of change was more visible than any expression would have been. Victor Halbert, mid-sentence at the podium, tracked the movement. His eyes found Marco at the side of the room. His expression did not change either, but he found Marco, and Marco saw him do it. After the remarks, after the room relaxed back into reception format, after the caterers began circulating and the ambient hum of 47 conversations resumed, Victor Halbert crossed to where Marco was standing. "A conversation," Halbert said. "Yes," said Marco. "Tomorrow." "Of course." Halbert looked at him, a long, level look that contained several years of professional trust and the specific question of how much of that trust was still intact. Then he nodded, once, and turned back toward his guests. Lina came out of the corridor. She stood beside Marco and they both looked at the room, at Carver near the far window with Voss at his side, at Halbert moving through the guests, at the empty stage in the northeast corner with its lights still up. "It started," she said. "Yes." She picked up a glass of water from a passing tray. "Drank it." "Set it back." "The story publishes tonight," Marco said. "The first one." I know. She looked at the window where Carver stood. He was speaking to someone, another guest, someone she didn't recognize, and his hands were moving with the ease of long practice, the gestures of a man who has told the same version of himself so many times it has become indistinguishable from who he actually is. She watched him. Chapter 10, Emotional Resolution with Future Danger Open. She took the train back. Not a car, not Marco's driver. She'd said no to both before they'd even been offered, and she'd taken the elevator down to Lexington and walked 2 blocks to the 86th Street station and stood on the platform in her performance clothes with her bag over her shoulder and waited for the downtown train like anyone else. The car was mostly empty at 11:15 on a Thursday. She sat and watched the lights of the tunnel run past the window and felt the particular exhaustion that lives below fatigue, the kind that isn't about sleep, that no sleep will entirely address. Her phone had been buzzing since 9:40. She didn't open most of it. She opened the text from her brother, saw the first story. "Call me when you're out," and she texted back on the train. "Tomorrow." She opened the email from the Connecticut Arts Review journalist, which was 2 sentences requesting a comment, and she closed it without responding. She opened nothing else. The train surfaced briefly above ground somewhere around 125th Street, and she looked out at the lit windows of the apartment buildings running past, the compressed geometry of lives arranged vertically, each floor its own small contained world with its own specific weight. She had given Carver no interview. She had given no statements. She had stood on a stage under her own name and performed a piece she'd first learned at 17, and then she had stepped off the stage. That was what she'd done. She thought about the carriage house floor. The wood uneven at the edges, firm in the center. She thought about the sequence she'd run in the kitchen at 12:40 on a Monday morning in her gray sleep shirt on cold stone, and the particular shame of being seen doing it, and how the shame had been real and also, it turned out, the only door that was available to walk through. Those 4 words are still on her screen. And the story is not finished. If you read every chapter without skipping, you already know why. Drop more names in the comments if you made it to the end. And if you think Lina should respond to that journalist, subscribe, because what happens next depends on whether this story finds the people it was built for. Share it with one person who finishes what they start.